Good morning, good afternoon to all our audience joining us from various time zones. My name is Raymond Karam. I'm the Chief Program and Development Officer here at AGSIW. Thank you all for joining this seventh annual Petro Diplomacy Conference. We're so delighted to be able to do this conference and host this important discussion for the seventh year running. Hopefully next year we'll see you all in person as we used to do before pre-COVID. This year's conference, the signature annual event, brings together stakeholders in the energy sector of the Gulf Arab states, global supply competitors in North America, analysts and policymakers to discuss how changes in technology, fiscal priorities and opportunities for growth continue to alter the relationship between politics and energy for both the region and the world. We're delighted to kick off this discussion and this conference with a keynote from His Excellency, the Minister of Energy and Oil from Bahrain. And I will let Ambassador Douglas Silliman introduce him in more detail before we get started. But before we do that, I will introduce Ambassador Silliman, the president of the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. He previously served as the U.S. Ambassador to Iraq from 2016 to 2019 and U.S. Ambassador to Kuwait from 2014 to 2016. He also served as senior advisor in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs in the U.S. State Department and working on Iraq issues and the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit. He was Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Iraq, Minister Counselor for Political Affairs in Baghdad from 2011 to 2012, and Deputy Chief of Mission in Ankara, Turkey from 2008 to 2011. Just a quick reminder, if you haven't seen it yet, I wanted to flag the scene setter for this conference. Gulf Countries Gear Up for a Net Zero World, authored by AGSIW non-resident fellow Kate Dorian. And I will share a link to that scene setter in the chat function shortly. And with that, Ambassador Silliman, over to you.
Raymond, thank you very much for that introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us today, wherever you happen to be in the world. I am indeed Doug Silliman, the president of the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the AGSIW's 7th annual Petro Diplomacy Conference, Gulf Countries in a Net Zero World. It is also my great honor to introduce to you right now our opening keynote guest, His Excellency Mohammed bin Khalifa bin Ahmed al-Khalifa, the Minister of Oil and Gas of the Kingdom of Bahrain. His Excellency graduated with honors from the King Fahd University of Petroleum and Minerals. He then received a master's degree from the University of Cambridge, an advanced master's from the Imperial College of Science, and an MBA from DePaul University's Kelstad Graduate School of Business. After holding a number of consequential positions in the Bahraini government, he was named Minister of Oil and Gas in 2016. So, Your Excellency, welcome to AGSIW and our 2021 Petro Diplomacy Conference. It is an honor to have you here with us today. As we said, the theme of this year's conference is Gulf Countries in a Net Zero World. So I'd like to start the conversation with a very general question to you. How do you see Bahrain in an increasingly net zero focused world going forward?
Well, first of all, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you, Ambassador Silliman, and everybody joining us today and taking time off after their busy schedules. It is indeed an honor for me to be joining you here, and all thanks and appreciation to the Arabian Gulf Institute for setting up this meeting. As you know, yes, the climate change agenda is high up in all governments' targets these days, as the COP26 meeting coming up in Glasgow is just around the corner. Bahrain is a small island state, so it's quite unique in that regard, and yet we are an exporter of oil and gas. So we're kind of in both camps. We're an oil exporter, but at the same time, we go under the small island state pretext, which, countries in that category are most affected by the impact of climate change. And that's what net zero is trying to achieve ultimately. The idea is that rising temperatures are causing all sorts of challenges to countries. One of the things Bahrain has identified is, water resources in this part of the world are scarce, and energy is predominantly the main source of water. Desalination is by far the number one source of water desalination, and we are the largest consumers in the region of desalination technology in terms of scale and size. So we recently have collaborated with the Green Climate Change Fund, which is based in Korea, and it was set up as an offshoot of the framework agreement from the United Nations for the developed nations, helping developing nations to avoid having the same kind of emissions as they go through the development cycle of their economies. And the idea is really to target not impacting as severely the CO2 emissions as was done in the past. But we worked with them on the issue of water resources, and it's been a very successful collaboration so far. And we've managed to really pinpoint the resources available to us, not only desalination, but we have deeper reservoirs that we identified as having less saline water that are good strategic reserves for the region. We've also studied deeply the costs of desalination technology. That's been coming down together with technologies like solar and other renewable energy technologies. And in that regard, Bahrain has set up certain standards together with the region. You know, they have targets of achieving certain percentages of renewables. And you know, being an oil minister, we also participated in that endeavor. Some of the things we have done, we have worked with the Electricity and Water Authority and recently set up Sustainable Energy Authority on piloting a few projects. We've installed solar panels on houses, and we've been monitoring the results. And ultimately, we want it to be commercial. We're not going to rush into anything before we prove commerciality, and that's critical for going towards net zero. One of the risks countries face is that they overdo it too quickly and end up having a huge bill that's unsustainable financially. But you know, with advent of technology, with the drop in solar panels, I think we saw 25 to 30% reduction in household consumption. We've also piloted implementing the new efficient electricity usage process called ESCO on a few buildings. And the project went live, and we're already seeing 20, 30, 40% reduction in their monthly electricity bills. So these things now can be converted to a policy drive to allow private sector and public sector to work together towards achieving those environmental targets ultimately. And the region has been talking about it on multiple fronts. But at the end, in terms of actual scale, we remain a very small contributor in the region. The problem is when you put in ratios like population, we kind of stand out. But in the truth, when it comes to carbon volume in tons, it's, I think, barely 3% of the world. But the challenge is those ratios skew, the focus of intensity. And because we have reasonably sparse populations in the region compared to other areas, and when you do it per capita, it's almost unfair for us. And that's, I think, one of the challenges we face. But in terms of Bahrain, I think we will have to be considered a small island state, ultimately, and there should be benefit for us there. But truly, we are on that drive. We've been investing heavily in upgrading our assets to be more efficient. We're adding renewables. We're trying to bring them in. As you relieve subsidies from electricity prices, you make renewables, solar, etc., more commercially viable. And that's one of the things the governments have been doing in the region. The challenge of the past has always been, how do you compete with heavily subsidized industry? You can't. Now that people are waking up to the fact that you can't continuously subsidize these utilities, you're giving renewables a fair chance, and we're proving that it's actually possible. So it's definitely coming into the mix.
Well, thank you very much for that discussion of Bahrain's focus. I wanted to broaden that very question and get your opinion on what you see happening in the world. What do you see as the most common strategies that countries in the region and around the world are following to try to reach net zero? I mean, you've talked about expanding renewable energy resources, distributed solar in Bahrain. We talked a bit about reducing carbon intensity, but there's carbon capture, utilization, and storage. There's the idea of simply planting more trees, reducing methane emissions from natural gas production, or frankly, from beef cattle, as well as increasing efficiency standards for automobiles, for construction that you talked about. What do you see as the major trends around the world that will contribute to net neutrality? And do you think that these major trends and the money going toward them are most efficiently placed, or might you see a different distribution of money or priorities?
All of the above. I think there is a risk. These are real headwinds today. And one of the challenges is already access to capital for the oil and gas sector has been curtailed. Now, the consequences of that we're already seeing. Europe has been hit hard with underinvestment and under storage of gas in the energy bill. The challenge with hydrocarbons are they're not yet replaceable for a few decades, to say the least, maybe even more. We need to always scrutinize the science. I mean, I like to be a bit controversial with this, but the rush to net zero at this pace is going to have dire consequences that might ultimately end up with us completely ignoring it in the future once we increase the energy bill. Energy is the most important commodity for human development these days. People can't do without it. And the risk we're seeing now is that the costs are going to be high. We're going to be hit by the economic cycle of low investments and high prices. We've already gone through a 7-year cycle of low prices in oil and gas and huge underinvestment, made even worse by last year's COVID issue. For a few months, we saw demand drop by 30 million. So we have to keep an eye on the science. Yes, we want to go towards net zero. Yes, all these targets are important. But let us not forget, carbon dioxide is not a toxic gas. We're talking about temperature increase here, and there are various ways of solving it. CCUS, definitely. The challenge with all these projects is how do you make them commercially viable without, on the other side, increasing the cost of energy. It's a very delicate balance. And if policy comes in too quickly, we will often mess it up. The best thing to do is for the economy to manage it well. That's usually the best policy. Looking at history, Europe went into renewables a bit too quickly. They ended up paying a huge price. Now, renewables kind of make sense commercially. So the idea was right, but if you mistime it, guess what? It's going to be too expensive. And that's the risk, again, I see with the environment. And that's where we have to be extremely careful. I like to be a bit controversial with these things because it's good for us to open and scrutinize our decisions. I've seen the oil market since 2014 when the price crashed. $1 trillion went out on the investment cycle. Now, by the time we realize it, and we're realizing it now, we're going to scramble to raise capital. And suddenly, the drive towards net zero is making funding difficult. So the supply challenge is actually a reality now. Who would have thought that we'd be worried about oil supply for the next few years, given where we were? For the short-term view of the energy markets is extremely dangerous and volatile. If we do not really focus on this capital investment drive, this sector needs in multiple years to see the results of an investment. Once you cut back for 7 years, now you're trapped in the boom cycle of commodities. And the same applies with multiple commodities today. So it's not as easy and exciting as people think. Because, the revenge of the old economy is coming back. I think, who said that? That was Goldman Sachs, Jeff Curry. He's calling it, now it's the revenge of the old economy. Because a lot of the investments went into technology for the past 2 years. And suddenly, we're realizing that, we've underinvested here. And we really don't have an alternative yet that has the scalability of hydrocarbons. So going back on what can help us achieve net zero, CCUS works. It is not commercial as of yet. People are trying to put a price for carbon, but that in itself is a double-edged sword. Planting trees is definitely a good one. I think that's one which could help development on both sides. That I don't know how effective it could be, but the science has to work. So scrutinizing the science is going to be critical going forward, not just to accept it as a given. I think that's where I stand, I guess.
Let me drill down a little bit more on something that you just mentioned. What at the time was called the demand and destruction for fossil fuels that accompanied the coronavirus pandemic and the immediate slowing down of the world economy. I know that Bahrain and other producing countries had to make some very significant adjustments to make supply and demand meet a bit. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience in the past year and a half and the mismatch between a quickly dropping demand and how you suppliers had to adjust to that?
Well, it's a very important story, and this is true petrol diplomacy. And the US had a huge role to play with. Very important role of leadership together with the large producers, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Russia, and many other countries. So it's, when COVID hit beginning of last year, we saw demand start to wobble, 10%, I think, maybe a bit less, by the time they had this OPEC plus meeting in Vienna. So all countries were of the view that, okay, we've lost 1 million barrels in demand per day. We need to do cuts accordingly just to make sure we don't oversupply the market. And the Russians decided no. I think at the time, Russia had a view that no, it's not the right time. So there wasn't an agreement at the end, and everybody walked away. We discussed what if it gets worse? This was just the beginning of what could be a pandemic. At the time, it was only called an epidemic. It wasn't yet a pandemic. But as we now know, it got worse. And the decision of this agreement meant that everybody was going to flood the markets, which they did come April. And all disaster struck. I have never seen a market where you lose 95% of jet fuel demand just overnight. You had 95% of global airplanes grounded. I was waiting for the day where our marketing people would tell me we cannot sell. They were selling into storage. And we were about to hit storage tank tops by May. Prices in the US, as you know, hit negative territory, which was never seen in history. Well, that's unique to the fundamentals of the WTI index. But we did see minus $40, was it? Minus $39. People actually pay you to take the oil. But in terms of us, it was $17. And that's way too low for any investments. And hence it was darkness, total darkness in the oil and gas sector. And it was out of the hands of OPEC and OPEC Plus. They don't have that kind of supply to curtail. You had 30 million barrels per day of demand lost. So, I actually was asked by a group of GCC ministers, His Royal Highness Prince Abdulaziz and the other GCC ministers, and okay, let's try and find out. His Excellency, the Minister of Azerbaijan, is a close friend, and I called him up. And he said, well, the Russians now want to come back to the table. Now they see but 1.5 million is no longer viable. So, and it was stalemate. Nobody knew how to begin. So I called up Secretary Bruyette, who was the Secretary of Energy. And I told him, this is what happened in Vienna, and everybody wants to come back, but it's beyond OPEC now. 30 million barrels needs the entire world to come in. So he said, well, are you suggesting that the US also participate? But we are a federal government. We don't have control of oil production. Which I understand. I'm not suggesting that you do that. But you actually do have control through the states. Texas has something called the Texas Railroad Commission. And in history, they actually did force policy on producers. We don't need that. The large international oil companies in the US are going to unilaterally drop production. So ask them, how much are you going to cut? Use that as the commitment from the US. Talk to the Saudis and the Russians. And the Saudis had the G20. I suggested use the G20 as a platform and invite the other large producers, Canada, Brazil, Norway, and the UK. And Prince Abdulaziz did that together with Secretary Bruyette and Alexander Novak, the three of them. Of course, President Trump, King Silliman of Saudi Arabia, and President Putin collaborated in getting everybody into a G20 meeting in July of last year. 20 million barrels of supply were taken off the table, and the market stabilized. And this is where we are today. It did save hundreds of thousands of jobs in the oil patch because it would have been a bloodbath. For that is true petroleum diplomacy at its best, and the US had to intervene.
It's an interesting story to tell. Sheikh Mohammed, thank you very much for that insight and your personal stories of how this was all accomplished. I want to talk a little bit more about the very controversial topic of peak oil, the point at some point in the future that is predicted for the consumption of oil, of gas, of coal to begin to drop. If I could first ask you to talk about this from the demand side, what do you see with the pressure to gain net neutrality in many places in the world? As the demand for fossil fuels going forward, where do you see demand softening? Where do you see demand continuing to at a steady pace? And do you see demand for some parts of the fossil fuel market increasing?
It's once you try to predict the future that far away, it's very difficult. I think it's always best to be prudent and prepare for all possibilities. I don't think anybody knows what the future holds for us. We can all try to strive towards something. But fundamentally, you do not have yet enough replacement technologies for hydrocarbons, and that's a fact in my view. We do have a lot of wishful thinking. We do have a strong will to go to net zero. But something with the scale that oil and gas would give us is non-existent. It's complementary, yes. And that's where I think reality is. We should absolutely strive to find something to replace it. But in the meantime, as I said, if we do it too quickly, if policy comes in a bit too quickly, and history is a lesson, then you pay a price. The challenge with oil is, in certain sectors, it's almost irreplaceable. I don't see a replacement to jet fuel yet. There isn't anything. I don't see a replacement to diesel either. In mining all these rare earth metals needed for renewables can only be done with diesel. There is no fuel that can really compete with diesel, unfortunately. And these are facts in my mind. I like the talk about heading towards neutrality and peak oil, but with what? And the challenge is scale. You might have technology that work, but where is the scale? It could be battery technology in the future, but still, battery technology remains expensive. And we're not there yet. We need some kind of a breakthrough. The challenge with the discussion now is that the people are applying rules and regulations today. As I said, access to capital, especially for upstream, is now barred in many financial institutions, including export credit agencies in the West, Europe mainly. And I've dealt with a lot of the European export credit agencies, the UKEF, the UK SACE, the Italian SETE, the Spanish. And these are important financial institutions for mega projects, because banks today, without these government-backed institutions, can't fund long-term because of Basel. So we've overburdened the system in many ways. And now we're adding the environmental side of things. And already hydrocarbon, especially in Europe, is a heavily taxed commodity, 70-75% at some time. You're going to smack it again with a carbon tax. So what are we going to do? Suddenly, energy, the most important commodity, is going to be extremely expensive. And that's a risk. That's a risk to human development, especially to poorer countries. I think people have to wake up. We have to be careful. I can see it today. Nobody's going to fund hydrocarbon projects. Guess what happens? Supply takes a hit. And the 7-year cycle of boom bust continues, continuously comes. We've just had 7 years of low prices. Well, people are now throwing numbers like $100, $200 a barrel. That's certainly not good for producers nor consumers. Maybe people on the renewable side think that it's a good thing for prices to go that high. But the challenge then, if you don't have scale on the other side for a solution, it's never going to come. Yes, we can say, okay, $200 will be there for a while, but then the only way to bring it down is to allow hydrocarbon investments to continue until there is a real replacement. And this is where reality has to strike us, as opposed to just going after targets that might be a bit ahead of its time, because it's not enough for the idea to be right. The timing has to be perfect as well.
Let me ask you to talk a little bit more about the future market for natural gas. A number of people who support net neutrality at an early date also believe that natural gas is likely to be a transitional fuel. And many other people believe that only natural gas can supply industrial scale, large scale electrification for energy poor areas, especially Africa. So can you talk a little bit how you view the future of gas markets going forward?
Gas, again, a hydrocarbon, and fundamentally, hydrocarbons burn hydrogen. So we have to remind ourselves, it's the valuable commodity in this is hydrogen. So in oil and oil-related products, the hydrogen is mixed with other carbon molecules, and it's liquid in room temperature. So it's fungible, you can carry it, put it in a tank, and that's the magic of it. Gas is a bit more challenged because it's gas form, and you need very low temperatures to liquefy it, high pressure, difficult to do. Hydrogen is even more difficult, but fundamentally it's the hydrogen in these molecules that is the store of energy. So gas does not have the fungibility and mobility of liquid fuels, but it would primarily be an electricity generation fuel. And that's important for electrification. Electric vehicles are definitely coming in. So gasoline, if you noticed, I haven't talked much about gasoline, but because that is something that technology can replace with time. Car batteries are still need development. Hybrids are probably the best. But gasoline demand is certainly, I can see the demand dropping with the electrification of vehicles. Diesel has not yet been competed with for EVs. So gas would be the source of electricity generation. Now, what will it be replaced with? Again, the challenge would be scalability. You need something not only is energy efficient and affordable, but is scalable enough to compete with the trillions of standard cubic feet of gas molecules that can traverse the world. Gas's only challenge, other than the emission of carbon, is the way you carry it. When you liquefy it, gas is transported in liquefied form, which you have to drop it to minus 260 degrees centigrade, high pressure, in special vessels, and then deliver it into a regasification terminal. 2/3 of the price of the commodity is the transportation cost. So one of the challenges of gas is that it costs more to deliver it, transport it on ship than it is to produce it. And that has always been a disadvantage of gas. Transition fuel, yes, but transition for the next 50, 100, 200 years, that's the real question.
Let me mix the two topics we've been talking about, which is net neutrality and peak oil. And if you will, play devil's advocate for a moment. We have seen that boards and shareholders for ExxonMobil, Shell, Chevron have put great pressure on those companies to invest in renewables to achieve net neutrality of those companies more quickly. My question for you, Excellency, is do national oil companies have to follow the same path? You have different roles in your countries. You respond to governments, not shareholders. So is it actually necessary for national oil companies to set net neutrality targets, or does it make more sense to continue with your current responsibilities to provide funding for governments and provide income for your populations and services for your populations unhindered by goals of net neutrality?
You can't go unhindered with that. It's now definitely part of government's targets. What comes out of the meeting in Glasgow is going to be critical. You will see that come into NOCs, definitely. It's already in there. So, and unfortunately, you have to do both. You have to continue doing what you used to do, but with the new challenge of achieving neutrality, net neutrality, going into renewables, etc. So capital funding is going to be a challenge. As I said, one of the things we've been trying to do is to make these projects financially feasible. Some are, but not all. That's one of the challenges, because if you just spend it for the sake of spending money, sustainability goes away, because you'll be able to do it when prices are high, but when prices are low, you won't be able to do it. So unless you can make it sustainable, it's going to be a challenge. Like definitely governments' commitments will trickle down into NOCs immediately.
And you had mentioned earlier that there has been a lack of investment over the past 7 years in a low oil price environment, particularly in upstream investment, at least in the private sector. Has this been true for national oil companies as well, or have the major NOCs continued to invest in upstream at a greater rate than the IOCs and private sector development projects?
Definitely NOCs invested more. We started our biggest investment in a refinery that's maybe a year away from completion. And it's timed just perfectly. We had to do it. You're upgrading your product slate to be compliant with all the new standards. So it's the best thing is to always be counter-cyclical investments. The rule of buy low and sell high is known by everyone, but very difficult to achieve sometimes. International oil companies are challenged by their boards, definitely. Some did, but in general, investments in exploration was ceased for the past 2 years. It's coming back gradually. And that's, the alarm bells are being rung because of this. We are at the lowest point in history in terms of discovery of oil and gas fields. And at the same time in investments as well. And COVID exacerbated the issue even more.
So I want to take a couple of questions now posed by our audience. We have 2 questions that are focused on potential supply, one relatively general, and would ask your opinion on fission technology and the ITER project. Do you see new technologies, new nuclear technologies, as a viable option for the future? And if not for Bahrain, where might this be an effective technology going forward?
Well, we do have the first nuclear power plant operational now in Abu Dhabi. So that's a huge development. Of course, nuclear energy is a challenge in this region. As you know, the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons is a challenge. So the GCC and Abu Dhabi as well is signed up and has contributed to the international efforts there. Fusion we've heard of for many years. I don't see anything tangible yet. They're talking about mini nuclear now, mini fission, electricity generation. Certainly the experience in Abu Dhabi is one to watch. I believe Saudi Arabia could be next soon. There are various technologies they can choose from. There's the hard water technology that the Canadians use, and that gives you less of a problem with nuclear waste, but it has its challenges. One of the challenges with countries is they cannot have their own production of energy-ready uranium. So I think Abu Dhabi is now. I'm not fully aware of how they purchase it, but they don't invest in that area. So it's definitely a route going forward. Bahrain is too small for a nuclear power plant. I wouldn't think that we would be wise in going towards nuclear. But I can see it in larger countries in the region, definitely, especially with the success in Abu Dhabi.
Let me ask another general supply question from our audience. Do you think that production of ammonia and hydrogen will increasingly be a large share of GCC exports over the course of the next 20 or 30 years, as the Saudis seem to have as their ambition with their new large green hydrogen project? So where do you see ammonia and hydrogen fitting into the mix of exports from the GCC?
Well, hydrogen as an export market is not yet tested. How would you export it? I mean, as I said, gas is already challenged. It took many decades to get the infrastructure done. So if the infrastructure builds, then yes. But would it be done quickly? I don't know. It has to be financially feasible. And hydrogen is notoriously difficult to transport. If gas was difficult, this is going to be even more difficult. Now, ammonia is a carrier. It is liquid. So it does meet some of those requirements. It doesn't have carbon in it, but it does have a lot of hydrogen. But one of the challenges people forget is ammonia is a toxic gas. And would there be an infrastructure for ammonia to be a carrier of energy? I don't know. And some people in process technology think it's a crazy idea to use ammonia. But it all depends if the market develops around it. And if it does, then absolutely, yes. But the challenge with ammonia is it's a toxic gas. It's deadly if it leaks. You don't have that with gas or oil or any others, but you do. You might have oil spills, etc. But ammonia is an extremely toxic gas. How do you deal with it when it's in mass transportation all over the world carrying energy? I really don't know. But if it does develop, yes, then investments will definitely go in that direction. So it's, as I said, predicting the future is very difficult.
Well, let me come a little bit closer to home then, perhaps look at the nearer future in Bahrain. One member of our audience has asked when you believe you'll be making final investment decisions on the Khalifa Bahrain shale reserves, and when do you think you might have first production from those reserves?
Well, we've been producing a few test wells, and we've been collaborating with a lot of the labs in the US to understand the rock. So it's we initially, when we started in 2018, we said 5 years. So we should be ready by then. So from 2018, it's been 3.5 years now. So 2 years, a year and a half to go. And with these oil prices, the chances of it going full scale are better.
Okay. Let me move back up to larger scale questions from our audience. The first one really has to do with the role of national oil companies, but specifically in Bahrain. The government of Bahrain recently decided to raise the VAT from 5% to 10%, and it has been posited in many of the countries of the Gulf that the VAT should be, over the longer term, a partial substitute for hydrocarbons earnings from exports of oil and gas. So how do you see the trend going forward of either reducing subsidies, increasing taxation as a way to potentially make up for a longer term lack or drop in export revenue from hydrocarbons?
It's good to have more fiscal tools in the hands of the government. And Saudi Arabia is already at 15%. So we're heading towards them, and it's the right policy. It kind of balances the challenge of the balance of payments, because the challenge is, we're importing economies in the region. And if suddenly oil prices drop, you've just lost a big chunk of your dollars coming in. But if you don't counterbalance your imports, you get imbalances in your balance of payments. Having the VAT actually helps as an extra tool. It's a fiscal tool for both the government, Ministry of Finance, but also the economy. But of course, you have to make sure that socially the impact on people is managed well. And we have the main consuming items exempt from the VAT. So there's more than 95 items that are not included day-to-day consumer items for people. So we don't exasperate. And the social challenge of removing subsidies is something that governments here are very careful with. You don't want to overburden people too quickly. But ultimately, it's the right thing to do. It's better to have people save and have more income than to give them their wealth in subsidies, because that drives excess consumption, inefficiencies, and everybody ends up being a loser. So we're trying to reverse, decades of low-cost subsidized utilities, which made us some of the highest consumers per capita in things like water in a region that has water scarcity, electricity, gasoline, diesel, etc. So we know that that's the right trend, but you have to do it in a way that doesn't impact people socially.
And I have one more question from the audience, again, on potential new sources of energy. The question is Bahrain considering possibly drilling deeper into the earth and looking for sources of geothermal energy? Others that have done this around the world, I don't know if Bahrain or anyone in the Gulf has the proper geology to do that, but is this an option in the Gulf or Bahrain?
But I did throw the challenge to our upstream guys. We did have a deep well, which we thought when we drilled it, we encountered very high temperatures. But I think the initial study said maybe not. We don't have that geothermal pockets that, but we'll continue looking. You know, I think on the western side of the Arabian Peninsula, you probably have a lot of that because of the tectonics here. The tectonics are quiet, but you go to the Red Sea area, maybe to the south in Oman, you do see geology violently jump up and down. That brings heat sinks closer to the surface. Definitely in Western Saudi Arabia, this part, Bahrain, Eastern Saudi Arabia, the other Gulf, maybe not. But we'll keep looking.
And your answer on Bahrain's shale reserves has prompted numerous other questions from the audience with more specific questions. So let me sort of bundle them into one. I guess the real question has been, are your shale reserves affected by the worldwide trend against investment in upstream? Are you able to find investment partners to develop the project? And do you have yet, based on your test drilling, any predictions of production targets when you finally do begin production in a year and a half or 2 years or 3 years?
Well, it's unconventional is a bit different. It's like a factory process. Once you start drilling, you continuously drill. You just have to find that magic configuration that you'll keep copying. And that's what we've been working on. We call it a completion. It's a specific way of drilling, etc. And that's what we've been studying technically. You drill the cores, you send the cores to the labs in the US. We've dealt with labs in Houston, labs in the University of Wyoming, which is the best in the world. And they do all the tests in the labs and they would simulate what happens. So we're not yet at that stage. Now, by the time we're there, one of the advantages we have is Bahrain itself is a large consumer of oil. We consume 220,000 or 270,000 barrels a day. With the new expansion, we're going to need 400,000 barrels a day. So that's lucrative for an investor to come in. There's no infrastructure risk. You just drill and you'd have a buyer next to the well. So that gives you a huge advantage in terms of investments. What we need to prove up first is the geological and technical viability of all of this. Hopefully, by the time we get there, there will be enough investors. Will there be investors now? Yes, I think the environment is you still have enough investors out there.
We have another question from the audience asking you to elaborate a little bit on your opening remarks where you talked about investment and accomplishments in Bahrain with renewable energy sources. You talked about some distributed solar, trying to find financial business viability for individual placement of solar units on houses. What does the rest of the renewables environment look like in Bahrain? Are you investing in larger scale renewable production, or is your focus distributed solar? Are you looking at wind or other technologies? And what are you doing on CCUS? I'll have cover the whole gamut there. Okay,
so let's start with solar. We're doing actually both. So the individual households, but also the larger scale. So we've been trying to collaborate with all the large oil and gas companies, but also companies like Alba, because with solar, the bigger the scale, the lower the price. And it could have a significant impact on their energy bills. But they've been working together to come up with a large-scale solar project. Now, for individual homes, one of the solutions I've been promoting to the Electricity and Water Authority, they're challenged with the social housing cost of electricity. It's probably one of the lowest in the world, and it's socially very difficult for them to raise it. And one of the solutions I suggested is, why don't we offer them a program where they can install solar power? And if it does give you 20-30% reduction in your consumption, then you can demonstrate that with a program like that, once you give them a year or 2 years, once you increase the tariff, and if you have the solar solution installed, effectively you're still paying the same amount because you would have reduced your consumption. But it goes hand in hand with subsidy relief. You're giving people solutions to conserve electricity, rather than just point blank just raise the cost 2 or 3 times, which obviously socially is going to create a big challenge for us with Parliament, etc. So others, I think, wind we're looking at. I haven't seen any studies saying that we can do it large scale yet. We do have a small wind corridor in the north of Bahrain, but can we make it large scale? I haven't seen anything yet. The ESCO program I told you about, we demonstrated it. So people with commercial buildings now, we've proven to them that this is a 2-3 year payment period for an investment any landlord can make for his infrastructure, and they can save 20, 30, sometimes even 40% on the monthly bill. But that's ready to go, and we'll probably have a press conference to showcase this, and then let the private sector move in that direction. CCUS, yes, we've been working on looking at one of the reservoirs as potential enhanced oil recovery technology. So that makes it viable. And we've been studying the best source of CO2. You can get it from the emission stacks of power stations from Elba. But the cheapest we found was to actually get it from the gas wells. The gas produced from the Bahrain field has a small component of CO2. You can actually separate it at the wellhead, and that becomes your cheapest source of CO2, and then re-inject it. We've been studying it, and we've been testing the geology of that reservoir, which makes it viable because you're pumping CO2 in, but you're actually producing oil at the same time. So that's our endeavor with CCUS. We do have it in our ammonia and urea plant, GPIC. They have been using it to recycle CO2 to go back into the production of urea and ammonia. And we have it in the refinery. They have CO2 food grade production that's sold into the industry here, but smaller scale than what we're trying to do on the upstream.
Last thing I wanted to ask you about moves toward net neutrality is as you mentioned in your first remarks, the very close link in the Gulf between usage of water and production of water through expensive means like desalination. And you mentioned ways that you are trying to incentivize Bahrainis to reduce their consumption of electricity. Are you doing anything similar to reduce the consumption of water, or any of your Gulf neighbors focusing on reducing the need for increasing need for desalinated water through water conservation programs?
Absolutely. It's at the top of the agenda of all governments here. Yeah, they're looking at network leaks. That's a significant component of lost water. They're looking at technologies to conserve in houses, human consumption. We are looking at other sources, looking at newer technologies for desalination. What do you do with treated water, for example? Gray water, black water, etc. It's a challenge, but certainly something that we've been looking at. We've been looking at maybe ways of charging in the saline aquifer sewage treated water that's potable. But what you do is you bring back the aquifer and push back the seawater encroachment. It's one of the challenges with climate change is you've got rising sea levels. And rising sea levels, that means the encroachment of seawater into underground water aquifers. Because fresh water comes from the west of the Arabian Peninsula and it pours into the eastern side, and Bahrain is a recipient of that flow. It's called Bahrain because you had, or you probably still have, freshwater springs in the sea. And this is why we have dugongs, which are relatives of manatees. And I haven't confirmed it, but it's known that manatees only drink fresh water. If dugongs are anywhere the same, they probably know where the freshwater springs and the sea are, and that's why they're in the region. There's also the conservation of the marine life when it comes to maintaining enough pressure in your freshwater aquifers to keep encroachment of seawater away.
A final question on Bahrain, then I want to move to a larger issue. One question about your new shale oil reserves and whether or not you think that the incremental production you will get from these new reserves will affect in any way Bahrain's strategy to reduce dependence on hydrocarbons. You mentioned that you're planning on using much of the production from the reserves for domestic use. Will this damage slow down or not really affect your longer term transition?
Well, it's a philosophical question. Can't answer it unless it becomes a reality. But if it becomes a reality, yes, well, it's human nature. It'll be more challenging, let's put it that way. But of course, we hope it becomes a reality. It is going to reduce our bill of importing hydrocarbons into the refinery. That's a big cost to the Bahraini economy. But hopefully, I think having these organizations like the Sustainable Energy Authority means that whatever happens on the oil side, you still have those entities focused on renewables and achieving net zero.
So for the final question in our conversation, let me ask you again something that has more to do with the diplomacy of petroleum markets. You mentioned, as you talked about the events of the past year and a half, how it was necessary to bring in partners outside of OPEC, Russia, the United States, other producers, to stabilize the markets following the great drop because of the coronavirus. How do you see the future of the organization of petroleum and hydrocarbon suppliers in the future? Is OPEC going to remain the main focus of your government's work internationally, or do you think ad hoc groups like OPEC Plus or something similar to that may have greater importance in the future as you look at regulating and stabilizing hydrocarbons markets?
We're not a part of OPEC, but we are part of the OPEC Plus. Now, there's controversy with OPEC. People call it a cartel. But the time I've looked at this, and this is probably specific to the era of a decade ago, it didn't really act as a cartel. It acted as a market balancing force. And it was very much needed. Will it continue being the same? That's what you'd hope. People will still be calling it a cartel, thinking that its main challenge lies in targeting a certain price. Price is very difficult to predict. What you want to make sure is that you have enough supply and that you have enough investment. If you have excess supply and the price drops, what happens? Investment drops, and you're creating a problem 5 years down the line. And that's where a balancing force is required. Now, if you go back to 2014, why did the oil market crash towards the end of 2014? It's because of shale oil. Now, why did shale oil come suddenly? You had 4 million barrels come out of the US. What triggered it? Was it market fundamentals? No, it was actually an induced stimulus. It was quantitative easing after the financial crisis. When, 2008 and 2009 financial crisis, the US Treasury pumped enormous amounts of liquidity into the US economy. A big chunk of that money, cheap credit, went into fueling the shale revolution. So you had an induced stimulus, which was supposed to be inflationary, accidentally give you an overproduction in the most important commodity in the world and created a deflationary stimulus on the end. So that's an unintended consequence of pumping dollars into the economy, created an oversupply, and we ended up cutting back on investments. And 7 years later, after 2014, now we're facing that lack of investment. So it's intervention in world economics is a very challenging thing, because you might try to do something here and suddenly it pops up somewhere else, as it did in oil. This is why collaboration is critical. And this is why I argued that OPEC Plus was extremely necessary to counterbalance that unintended consequence of quantitative easing into the oil industry. They had to do it to bring balance. Otherwise, you would have had to wait a longer time to get investments back. So the challenge was not the price. If you talk about the price, then that's a cartel. You talk about supply today and for the future. And that's what international collaboration is about. And it shouldn't just be producers, it should be consumers as well. Because if I'm a consumer and I have low oil prices today, and I see an underinvestment, I know that 5-7 years down the line, I'm going to be faced with very expensive oil again. So if we wanted to have something less volatile, organizations like this to balance markets are going to be critical. But people have to start changing the view. Cartels, yes, cartels want price. But market balance is about supply demand and investments.
Mr. Minister, thank you very much for taking your time to join us this morning and for launching in a very compelling way our 7th annual Petro Diplomacy Conference. Do you have any final words you'd like to say to the audience before we close this session?
Well, it's going to be a boom cycle for commodities, so good times for our part of the world. Headwinds of environment and net zero. Hopefully, we do the right thing, but it's hopefully the COVID thing is behind us now. We can't take another year of it. That's it, and hopefully we see demand coming back. So by 2022, maybe mid-year, we should be back to normal.
Your Excellency, Sheikh Mohammed bin Khalifa bin Ahmed Al Khalifa, thank you very much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure to have you with us. And for our audience, I will note that many of the issues that Sheikh Mohammed discussed this morning can be found in the excellent scene setter paper that non-resident fellow Kate Durian prepared for this Petro Diplomacy Conference. Raymond Karam put that up in our chat earlier, but you can also find it on AGSIW's website, www.agsiw.org. So with that, let me let the minister get back to his important duties in life in Bahrain and turn the program back over to Raymond Karam as our MC. Mr. Minister, thank you very, very much.
Real pleasure. Thank you all.